All right, everybody, welcome back to Seaside Joe, a football podcast and a Seahawks newsletter. I'm Kenneth Arthur, and throughout the offseason, I will sporadically be showing up to talk about the Seahawks in some form or fashion. Not really have a super defined curriculum for that, but that's football, that's life. You improvise as you go, and that's certainly what the Seahawks did this year, adding a few draft picks and subtracting a franchise quarterback. And it's going to be an interesting year, but for Seattle, the focus here, as much as possible, is to build the team around the quarterback position, to put out a team that has a solid offensive line as opposed to what they had in the last few years, to have a better defense than what they've had in the last few years. And then we'll get to talk about the 2023 quarterbacks as the year goes on, which has been what I've hoped for and expected the Seahawks to do since the Russell Wilson trade, which was to put off the quarterback position for a year, as next year there will be a lot of exciting prospects to talk about, as opposed to this year where it wasn't so encouraging necessarily with the class that we had. But the Seahawks do have a lot of encouraging players that they've added to the roster, a lot of things to be excited about, players to be excited about. Probably, as I said before, Charles Cross, he could be the best draft prospect that Pete Carroll has ever had with the Seahawks. So we're going to talk a lot about him as the year goes on. We're going to talk about their second round picks, and we're going to talk about everyone else that was added to Seattle's roster. And we're going to do a lot of that today with a guy who runs one of my favorite YouTube shows, period. And definitely one of my favorite NFL draft shows, Boom or Bust, the draft show. And Max Chadwick, you are here to talk about the Seahawks. Can you tell everyone out there listening a little bit about Boom or Bust, the draft show?
Yeah, 1000%. First of all, thank you so much for having me on. You've been one of our most loyal fans, and I've grown to follow you now and all your Seahawks, and now I'm Rams. I just learned coverage too, so I'm a big fan of yours now too. So I really appreciate you having me on. Boom or Bust was a show that some college buddies and I started in the 2020 draft under our campus television station that was under a different name. And it grew. We separated from them, and we had to make a new name because they own the IP for that. So we made a new name, and we did it for the 2021 draft, and it went so well. It was me, Nick, who's still on the show, and PJ, who's unfortunately for him, he's worked for the Lions now, and
Awesome.
Tate, who is working at NBC now too. But it was us three. Those two left, so we added Donnie, who was this big TikTok star that was a big fan of ours before the 2021 draft. We added him. He's been a superstar for us since joining, and hopefully we're going to continue adding some guys. But yeah, we basically just covered the NFL draft year round, and I'm sure a lot of people just don't care about the draft until the Super Bowl is over, until honestly a lot of people don't care until free agency is over. But we are sick in the head, as I like to say, and we love to talk about these kids. Like, I already have a top 50 big board for 2023. Like, I had that done the week after the draft was over. Like, I need to look ahead to the next draft. So yeah, we just talk about the NFL draft year round, and we just love NFL and college football, and the NFL draft is the perfect balance of those two things. So we've been doing that for the past 2 years now, and it's been going really well.
Yeah, I really enjoy your guys' coverage, and I love that you have those, 3 or 4 every show. You have those 3 or 4 different people who have their different perspectives, and you guys have different opinions sometimes. And but it's never like vicious. You guys aren't going after each other for having a different opinion. It's like, it's very good to know that people will see these prospects vastly differently, and to accept like the fate of them at the next level is not up to anybody analyzing the draft. It's not up to the teams. Sometimes it's not even up to the players, but whatever happens next will simply happen outside of our control. And we're just evaluating them as prospects, and just saying like, listen, as a prospect, these are the reasons why I think this guy should go number 5 and why I don't think this guy should go in the first round. And I think you guys have done an excellent job of doing that and presenting it in a format that I find like very enjoyable to watch. So for someone else who's sick in the head, who's been, I remember when I was younger, being in back when the draft was held over the entire weekend, starting on Saturdays. I was in a relationship, and I told my girlfriend at the time, hey, I don't know if you can contact me this weekend. The draft is on. It's like, that's what I'm doing for the entire weekend, and I'm gonna be not paying attention to anything else.
I find it really funny because my uncles would tell me all the time, they're like, it's so funny that you're covering the NFL draft and this is like your full-time thing, because your dad and your mom got married on the first round, during the first round of the NFL draft. And I was like, if I was alive, that was before I was born, obviously. If I was alive, I would have been like, listen, mom and dad, I'm sorry, I can't come. I need to watch the first. That to me is absolute. I can't believe my dad and my mom let that happen. That's lunacy to me, but yeah, it's pretty funny now looking back.
Yeah, but there's something about it. My favorite day of the year is the first round of the draft. There's just something about it, and for the Seahawks, we were talking before about how, if we were talking about the Rams today, may not be as interesting of a show, but that's the way that the Seahawks have operated too for a long time. Maybe not as dramatically, and over the last 5-6 years, not as successfully for sure. But the reason that I personally, it's not that I was happy that the Seahawks traded Russell Wilson, but I was happy that the Seahawks got back into the first round. I was happy that there were more prospects because, from a Moneyball perspective, from a team building perspective, I just didn't see another way for Seattle to improve their roster without taking better shots in the draft, getting a top 10 pick, getting an extra first round pick next year, getting an extra second round pick this year. Seattle needs to add good young players, cost controlled players to this roster if they're going to have any chance of competing in 2 to 3 years. I think, that was going to be very difficult with Russell Wilson. So even though Russell Wilson is a great player, so we'll see what happens with that regard. And I would love to get your thoughts on briefly on the quarterback class next year. But first, let's talk about Seattle's class this year. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I already have, if you want to talk about 2023 quarterbacks, I have like a top 20, right? So we'll get into that later. But this year's class, I mean, I liked it a lot. It's kind of surprising because, you talk about the Seahawks and the Raiders when Mayock was a GM was one of those teams too, where it's like, oh boy, here we go. Like whenever they got picking, it's like something like the Patriots this year was like that team where it's like, you don't know where they're going to go. They really, I gave them an A-, and really it was because of one pick that I wasn't a huge fan of, but I kind of understand. Well, I'm sure we'll get into that in a little bit, but they knocked it out of the park. I mean, they got Charles Cross, Boye Mafe, two guys who I think were slam dunk first round prospects, and they got both of them. Abraham Lucas, I love too. So those are two tackles now for the future. They had a big need at tackle, and they got the two best pass protecting tackles, I think, in the draft in Charles Cross and in Abraham Lucas. And then I like Tyreke Smith a lot. I like Coby Bryant. I like Tariq Woolen. Like I mentioned, Boye Mafe and Bo Melton. And I don't know. I thought it was a really awesome draft for the Seahawks. And it was just one little pick that I was a little hesitant on.
Yeah, and I think I know what pick you're talking about, and we'll talk about that for sure, as well as these other guys I'm pulling up here, sharing my screen for the Seahawks draft class. As you said, Charles Cross. I was trying to read this in order. I don't know why they put it in this particular order. Tariq Young, Coby Bryant, Bo Melton, Tariq Woolen, Boye Mafe, Charles Cross, Abe Lucas, Kenneth Walker, Tyreke Smith. We see their pictures there on the right side. And yeah, the Seahawks, one of the reasons, Max, that I think that it was harder to judge Seattle's picks in the past and then maybe a little bit easier this year, even though I with my journey with the Seahawks was as soon as they traded Russell Wilson and I did my first mock write-up and I looked at the prospects that were there on the board and I looked at Seattle's needs. The first mock draft that I did, I had Charles Cross going to the Seahawks. And then almost immediately afterwards, after I'd kind of measured Charles Cross's measurements against all of the left tackles that Pete Carroll has employed, drafted, he wasn't measuring up nearly as well in a few areas like a it was like his 10-yard split or something like the shuttle or the broad jump or whatever. And I felt like maybe I could be overthinking this. But I'd said maybe it's not Charles Cross, and I started to look at other areas and other players, even saying Bernard Raymond, thinking that at the time he might be a first-round pick, which obviously now we know he's been a third-round pick, similar to some other, similar to the quarterbacks in this class.
Yeah.
But Charles Cross was a guy who then when he actually became the pick, made the most sense, made perfect sense. He's a left tackle. I thought the Seahawks needed to draft a left tackle and not a right tackle, somebody that could play that position. And Charles Cross was the only guy at that position, at number 9, I should say, that was like, okay, here's a left tackle. And then there were just the aspects of this guy was in the most pass heavy offense in college football. Could he, handle the rushing offense for Pete Carroll? So let's just jump into Charles Cross then right off the bat. What was your evaluation of Charles Cross and how he fit in against Ike Ekwonu and Evan Neal and the other tackles in this class?
Trying to rank those 3 tackles was one of the hardest positions ranking in the 2022 NFL draft. Charles Cross, what I think differentiates himself from those other two tackles, is the ceiling is probably not as high as someone like Evan Neal for sure, or Ikem Ekwonu, but the floor is not even comparable. Like there is a world where I can see Evan Neal just not working out because there are a lot of issues that he needs to be cleaned up, mainly balance. And he and Ikem Ekwonu both are still pretty raw in terms of pass protection. Charles Cross is not that. Charles Cross is the best pass protecting tackle in the draft. There are no concerns, I think, with him in pass protection at all. He's just not as much of a freak athlete as the other two, which brought him down to number 3 in my tackle rankings. And I thought he had a lower ceiling. But I think the Seahawks, look, the other 2 are gone, and you took the best one, I think, in Charles Cross that was available. And I know a lot of people say, oh, the run blocking is a concern. The only thing that's a concern for me is that he didn't do it that much, because he actually, when he did do it, it looked pretty good. He had like an 85 plus PFF grade as a run blocker last year, even though they didn't run the ball that much. So it wasn't really a concern in terms of like when he was doing it looked bad. It was more because they just never ran the ball. So it's like, okay, he's going to be doing that a lot more, obviously, in Seattle next year. So that's going to be an interesting thing to monitor, but I'm not too worried about his run blocking. And like I said, I think he's just the highest floor offensive tackle in the 2022 draft.
How much, for somebody that covers the draft, the NFL draft, that means that you have to have a perspective on both college football and NFL football, the schemes offensively. Definitely offensively is what we focus on and talk about the most, is and scheme wise. And with the air raid offense that Mike Leach, I went to Washington State University, so I was, but that was well before Mike Leach had arrived, but still I was very cognizant, and I was following the Cougs when Mike Leach arrived, and we knew that for one, the air raid offense takes a little bit of time to install, maybe even a few years, especially as you get the right players in place to run it. And he went to Mississippi State before Mike Leach did, so he wasn't necessarily aware that he was even going to be a pass blocking to that degree left tackle. In fact, I believe the previous coach was a run heavy head coach who they were expecting to be more on the running side. But schematically, like, how much different do you find an air raid offense or Charles Cross's skill set at Mississippi State? How much different schematically do you think that is against, say, the spread heavy offenses of like a Joe Burrow with the Bengals or Matthew Stafford with the Rams? Like, how much different do you expect his skill set to need to be?
I actually think it's an interesting question. I think he's going to be okay, because I think it more, in terms of the quarterbacks when you come from an air raid offense, and as we've seen, Patrick Mahomes has been very fine coming out of Texas Tech. The air raid offenses, he had enough like true pass sets, which PFF calls, that it made me feel okay, because there are so many times the quarterback is dropping back. There are no, play action, which as we've seen can help out offensive line a lot. There wasn't as many play action, and there's so many true passes where he's just going one-on-one with the edge defender, and he was winning very, very consistently in 2021. Like I said, he was one of the best pass protecting tackles in the entire country that season. So the concern, like I mentioned before, that I have is that, like, okay, now you're not going to be like pass blocking every single snap. And now it's going to be more of a balance between run blocking and pass blocking. So how is he going to do with that balance? Schematically, I think he'll be okay in a pass blocking scheme. I liked him a lot in a zone blocking scheme, but I think he'd actually work in a gap scheme too. So schematically, I think the Mississippi State offense is going to be different in terms of how often they run the ball. But, you know, it isn't going to be too much different in terms of what he was asked to do as a pass protector.
Yeah, and speaking of, you know, athleticism, I don't know if you've seen this field goal attempt from Charles Cross. Didn't quite make it.
All right, I might lower my board then for that.
But we did talk too about you said that you had the two best pass protecting tackles in this draft. As we can see here, Charles Cross and Abraham Lucas. There's the connection to Mike Leach and the air raid offense there with both of these tackles. And we know that the Seahawks employ Shane Waldron as an offensive coordinator, former Rams offensive coordinator, assistant coach under Sean McVay. How much closer to being a starting tackle is Charles Cross as compared to Abraham Lucas in your mind?
That one's interesting too. I think Abraham Lucas is going to be a right tackle only, which, I mean, you get Charles Cross is like, all right, perfect, you know, which is maybe why he was a little bit lower. And I think Cross was a really good run blocker when they ran the ball. Lucas, I have more concerns about with them running the football, because I don't think he was a very good run blocker. Well, he was an okay run blocker at Washington State. He wasn't great. Whereas Charles Cross, I thought, was really above average and didn't get enough credit. Abraham Lucas is more like, okay, this guy is going to be really good in pass protection. He's been great in pass protection in that Mike Leach offense before he left to go to Mississippi State. So I have no questions about him as a pass protector. I think he's really good. His technique has gotten better every single year. He tested out way, way more athletically than I thought he would. I think, 97th percentile athlete tested out as, which is not what I expected. He was awesome at the Senior Bowl, which I think is a big test for offensive linemen too. When a lot of other guys like Bernard Raymond and other tackles just didn't look as good at the Senior Bowl, Abraham Lucas looked really good. So otherwise, I think Abraham Lucas is your guy at right tackle, and I think he's only a right tackle, and he's got some questions of run blocker. But I think he could start day one on the right side of the offense for the Seahawks with Charles Cross man in that blind side spot.
Yeah, with regards to the Senior Bowl, that's something that I've never really been drawn to, I guess. Even as a huge draft fan, I think like it hasn't been until recently that I've actually come to understand like the value of the Senior Bowl, especially to teams like the Seahawks and the Rams. But with the Seahawks, you know, it's been a place where they always draft early, you know, players that want their first early picks, like players who were at the Senior Bowl and usually performed well at the Senior Bowl. How would you recommend for myself or anyone out there, like following the Senior Bowl? Like, what are the best ways to like really understand after, like before, during, and after the Senior Bowl, like who's standing out and like what to be looking for?
So it's interesting because I think it's a tool, and I think the draft evaluation, as you mentioned, is a crapshoot. And so when you're, you know, in a crapshoot like the draft, you're evaluating everything you possibly can about every single prospect, which is why when people are like, I don't care about the combine doesn't matter, that's wrong in my opinion. Like the combine matters. It's just, you know, you shouldn't be drafting purely off the combine. You shouldn't see, for example, Trayvon Walker, who is a 99.9 percentile athlete. You see that guy, and you're like, well, he's a 99.9. Aiden Hutchinson's a 98.2 or whatever. We have to take Trayvon Walker. It's like, no, watch the tape too. Like, the tape is saying Aiden Hutchinson is way ahead. So Trayvon Walker was a perfect example of saying, oh, the combine is why he went number one overall, being one of the least productive first overall picks I honestly can remember. And then the second thing, the Senior Bowl is another tool. I think tape is definitely first and foremost. That's the most important thing. That's what you got to be looking at. But after that, like the combine and the Senior Bowl and their measurables, those things all matter because as we've seen time and time again, like they can be good indicators at the next level. And if a guy goes out there and, you know, is really good at the Senior Bowl, like another guy that the Seahawks drafted, that we'll get into. Actually, you pulled him up right there, Boye Mafe. He was awesome at the Senior Bowl, and I think that was another thing that raised my board. He was also an awesome athlete at the combine. He also had really good tape, in my opinion, which is why he was a first-round pick. So you got to combine all these things together. It's tough to say, what should be first. I think tape should definitely be first. I probably put more stock into athletic testing than I do into the Senior Bowl. But the Senior Bowl is a really, really good test for these guys because they're being coached by NFL coaches. They're going up against other future NFL players. And if a guy stinks it up at the Senior Bowl, like, it'll make you go back and reevaluate him and say, what did I miss? Or if a guy is really good at the Senior Bowl and you didn't like his tape that much, that can make you go back and reevaluate. So don't overrate any one thing. Like, if a guy is great tape but is a really bad athlete, like David Bell, for example, I'm not saying make him an undrafted player. I'm saying, like, maybe you shouldn't be as high on him because, as we've seen time and time again, like, how good you are in college isn't how good you'll be in the NFL. Like, it's being a prospect is a whole different thing than how good you are in college. So it's tough. You got to combine everything together. So it's tough for me to say anything is the most important thing, but and honestly, as much data as you can get for these guys as possible because it's such a crapshoot.
Yeah, I think it's great to definitely have that full perspective picture because listen, I mean, the draft has been going on for decades, and teams, really smart football people still make picks that don't work out. And really smart football people still let Russell Wilson fall to the third round. And, it's like trying to figure out that formula. I really, what I've really loved more and more as the years go on, and it sounds corny and cheesy and everything, and it's hard to evaluate. It's an intangible. I love guys who love football. I love guys who are just obsessed with being better. It's why I think that, like, for example, I think Kayvon Thibodeau got such a bad rap. And totally underrated by certain people who I think misjudge the fact that I think he really loves football and he wants to be a great football player. And the fact that he has the athleticism and the tape is why I would have picked Kayvon Thibodeau over Trayvon Walker. And I believe everyone on the Boom or Bust show agrees, right?
Oh my God. 1000%. It was that. And so I'm not saying Trayvon Walker doesn't love football. Like, that's not at all. But like, the Kayvon Thibodeau got the Justin Fields treatment last year, where it was like Justin Fields were coming into the draft, and some analysts were saying, "Well, I heard he's last guy in, first guy out. I heard he doesn't love football or anything like that." Like, dude, this guy had busted ribs in the college football playoff and threw 6 touchdown passes. This guy is running 80 yards downfield, throwing blocks for his running back after handing off. You're telling me that guy doesn't love football? You can have any question you want about his processing speed or anything like that, but when you're judging these guys' characters off of these stupid. Kayvon Thibodeau wore sunglasses inside of the combine, and that dropped him from like a top 5 pick to like, maybe he's a late first round pick. Thankfully, the Giants did not think that, but he really got the Justin Fields treatment. Like, I would have taken Kayvon Thibodeau number 2 overall. Aiden Hutchinson I would have taken number 1 overall. And you mentioned like guys who love football. Aiden Hutchinson. I work at PFF, and we did the Aiden Hutchinson podcast with him, and he was saying, he's like, I don't eat gluten. I don't eat tomatoes because they're inflammatory. I don't do I only eat things that help me, prepare. And I'm constantly watching tape. I'm constantly working out. It's like, this dude, he might not be like a superstar Myles Garrett or anything like that, but he's going to be good because there's no way Aiden Hutchinson will let himself fail in the NFL just because his mindset and his athleticism and the tape that he's already shown us. Like, this guy is going to be at least a good player. So that's why I had him number 1. And Trayvon Walker has a higher ceiling probably than Aiden Hutchinson, but it's really not that much higher. And I think the floor was so much lower. So that was a risky pick. And yeah, I agree with you. Like, how much these guys love football is definitely another aspect to keep in mind. It's just the problem for us is, we're not in the interview rooms and we're not talking to these guys. So I don't really like when media are like, oh, I don't like his character that much because I watched one post-game interview when they got blown out and he didn't seem that happy. It's like, yeah, no dog, man, because nobody would be that happy after that. So
it's so difficult to judge how anybody's going to react when they go, and it's different now because of NIL, but when they go from like, hey, I'm just a regular person who came from a regular background, or maybe even a bad background where I didn't have anything growing up, to now you have $30 million. How does anyone react to the fame and the money and the responsibility and the actual work and effort that it takes to become a great NFL
media,
player?
Us, judging a guy's character.
Got a frozen here. Wait for Max to come back. think we got a frozen situation, perhaps, if it's not just on my end. Anyone out there who is watching or listening, feel free to throw in a comment or a question for Max or myself as we go. I think Max is frozen. Looks like I'm not frozen, so I'm thinking it's not just me. We are watching. Okay, I think Max will come right back in, and we'll give this a reboot. Anyone out there, Seahawks listeners, watchers, if you're live, throw in a question or comment, anything you have to say. We're going to get into Boye Mafe and so much more to come. And now this is called stretching, stalling, and stretching. Boye Mafe. Is he from Golden Valley, Minnesota? Says that he is. I got to believe it. It's got to be a real thing because it's on NFL.com. 6.35. What does that mean? All right. Well, only so much stretching I can do. I think we'll be reset here soon. But yeah, I was gonna bring up something. Oh, here we go. I think we're back. Hey, what's up?
Hey, I'm so sorry. Our Wi-Fi here has been absolutely terrible with the weather the past few days, so I'm on my phone right now. I'm sorry about that.
No problem. But yeah, I was just saying that there's so much that happens in your life when you become an NFL player, and I think a lot of players who get by on being so much more athletic than the average college athlete.
Mm-hmm.
You have to like be better than the average NFL athlete and the average NFL veteran who's had 5 or 6 years of experience and so many snaps. And who's going to persevere and overcome those difficulties and those challenges where it doesn't matter if you're Jadeveon Clowney or somebody else. It's like you still have to go out there and be better than all these other guys. And then if you are a high draft pick like a Clowney, like look at Walker. If he has Jadeveon Clowney's career arc, people are going to call him a disappointment, even though Jadeveon Clowney, he's had a valuable career. Just when you're putting up on those perspective, number one. And I think this is something that I find so interesting too about the whole draft analysis process, which is, with Justin Fields last year, that was Dan Orlovsky saying like this is what he had heard, and he goes on the Pat McAfee show, and then there was such a backlash to that report that ever since then Dan Orlovsky is the biggest Justin Fields fan in the
world. Yeah,
and it was like campaigning for Matt Nagy to be fired. Which, hey, look. Obviously, the Bears needed to make a change, but yeah, it's such an interesting way to. Everybody's like got an opinion, and the only thing that matters is how these players perform on their own. Speaking of which, and speaking of like Justin Fields, but like moving it forward a year, a lot of Seahawks fans after the Russell Wilson trade were expecting, or at least hoping for, a quarterback pick this year. I've already said that I don't think that would have been a good idea, and that Seattle had to sit and wait it out and kind of just go through unfortunately a Geno Smith, Drew Lock year.
Yeah.
But the quarterbacks this year, to me, other than Kenny Pickett, who was an underwhelming prospect for different reasons, he was the only guy that last year had anything that could be considered like a Joe Burrow-y like breakout campaign, or a Zach Wilson-y breakout campaign. Did you think that there were any quarterbacks worth a first round pick this year other than, maybe not even other than Kenny Pickett? Did you think that there were first round quarterbacks this year?
Yeah, surprisingly, Kenny Pickett wasn't one. So the two I had were Sam Howell, who I'm a big fan of, and Malik Willis. But I had them as like, and I judge my board using positional value. So like, I can love a running back, and he'll still probably be like 35 to 40 on my board, just because that's how the NFL draft works. You could say all you want that this guy's the best prospect, But, Tyler Linderbaum was the best football player in the draft, and he fell to 26 overall. So it's like, it's a different thing in the NFL draft. That's why I only love big boards that don't use positional values. It's like, that's not how it works. That's not how the NFL draft works. But Sam Howell and Malik Willis, I thought was worth maybe. I know Sam Howell would not go in the first round. Malik Willis falling out of the first round was surprising to me because he's very raw and he's extremely raw. But I think I'm a Steelers fan, just FYI. Like, I would have loved the Steelers to take him because they have the environment that can develop a Malik Willis, where you see like Josh Allen was raw coming out of Wyoming, and he was raw his first 2 years, and now he's a world beater. Patrick Mahomes, you're like, who the heck is this guy going to be coming out of an air raid offense? And he's one of the best quarterbacks probably going to go down as one of the best quarterbacks of all time. You see other guys too. Justin Herbert. I had so many questions about Justin Herbert coming out, but it turns out the Oregon scheme was holding him back, not Justin Herbert. So Malik Willis is raw, but he's playing at Liberty. You're not getting the best coaching probably at Liberty. He was a guy I wanted to go to a good situation. Like I said before the draft, I can tell you whether or not Malik Willis will probably be a success in the NFL just based off where he goes. And now he's going to Tennessee. I'm excited for him. I think that's a good situation for him. If he went to Pittsburgh, it's a good situation for him. Seattle would have been a little interesting. I don't know if I would have loved that for Seattle. So I would agree with you. But, when you get into that range of like number 41 overall, and you take Kenneth Walker III, who I wasn't a big fan of that pick. I like him at that range, but just not for the Seahawks. I would have taken probably Malik Willis or Sam Howell and roll the dice on them.
I mean, yeah, that is certainly one of the strategies. I mean, there's no way like for anybody to say, just like looking at the 2012 class. I mean, you look back at 2012, that year you had Andrew Luck. Everybody had going number one, understandably so. Number two, Robert Griffin III.
Yep.
Could have been number one in a lot of other years. I believe number 8 was Ryan Tannehill. Number 22 was Brandon Weeden. And then you're getting into like Brock Osweiler at 57. And then after that, you had Russell Wilson, Nick Foles, and Kirk Cousins, who were all, more successful than the guys that went ahead of them.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously Andrew Luck would have been more successful than some of those guys if he hadn't had to retire for injury reasons. But it's like evaluating these guys. Maybe you can come away with the Kirk Cousins in the 4th round. And it's like looking at Malik Willis or Desmond Ridder or Sam Howell, who I would have said, hey, look, if the Seahawks were going to pick a guy there at 41 or 40, Sam Howell was a guy that I felt like probably fit better into what Seattle wants to do. And maybe didn't have as much work to do to like sort of get better. I don't even know like whether it's like get better, because it's like, as you were saying, playing at Liberty for Malik Willis, it's like he's not playing with NFL players. He's not playing against NFL players. He's not, he's not fitting into, say, anything that resembles an NFL offensive scheme. If he's going out there and sort of sandlotting it and like kind of just like making decisions on the fly because he's so good that he can do that at that level against those players, where it's like not very many players at a school like Liberty or going up against a school like Liberty had a guy who was recruited to play quarterback at Auburn. It's such a different level that he's playing at. And at the same time, it's like he might also just go to the next level and they go, oh, well, he's just not also going to fit here, just like he didn't fit in with Auburn for whatever reasons. And at the same time, it could be like Josh Allen, where, as you're saying, it's like, hey, look, given NFL coaching, and it's like you do have to have good NFL coaching, given that opportunity, then maybe Malik Willis will come into something. My biggest fears were just like, you're taking a guy who might be a 25% shot to become a starting quarterback in the NFL. Maybe instead you take a 75% shot to take a running back or to take a player at another position that you feel is going to be ready to go or be a good NFL player, just because Seattle has had so many bad picks. And it's like, God, just get in some good players, because you don't have very many, as opposed to the Steelers, where it's like they have a lot of good players, but they don't have a quarterback at that point. So yeah, I do agree that having that landing spot is so important. And it's also why guys like to some degree, Kirk Cousins and Russell Wilson and Nick Foles did work out because they didn't have to go to teams picking first, second, and third that had so many other problems. And it's good to sometimes be like Mac Jones and go to the Patriots instead of, going to the Jaguars or the Jets, where it's like the learning curve is going to have to be so much larger. Anyway, back to the players that the Seahawks did pick. Boye Mafe, you mentioned him earlier as a guy that you really liked in this draft. How early do you think Boye Mafe can contribute at the NFL level?
He's a very interesting one. So like I mentioned before, the Senior Bowl was one of the events that really loaded on, and he was, an immediately a very productive player at the Senior Bowl. He also was really productive in college too, and I think a lot of people underrated his college production. I think he was a really good pass rusher at Minnesota. I ended up having him at edge 5 in the draft. I just love his athleticism. He tested as a 99 percentile athlete. He was excellent at the Senior Bowl, like I mentioned. He's not a good run defender, and that's the thing that dropped him on a lot of people's boards. That he's just not a great run defender. He's a little bit older. He's a redshirt senior coming out. But like I mentioned, like that freaky athleticism coupled with the flashes, the consistent flashes that we saw as a pass rusher, I think Boye Mafe is a guy that can definitely contribute year one. I just think he's got a lot of work to do as a run defender, but I'd rather have a guy who's got a lot of work to do as a run defender than a guy who's got a lot of work to do as a pass rusher. Because I've seen before, time and time again, the passing game is the most important thing in the NFL. So anyone who affects the passing game is going to be valuable. And I think Boye Mafe is going to be a guy that's valuable for the Seahawks.
And he wasn't the only player drafted at that position or around that position. You mentioned also Tyreke Smith. What are your thoughts on Tyreke Smith? Is he somebody who could potentially, make the Seahawks roster and even contribute as a rookie?
I think he definitely is. I had Tyreke Smith edge 17. I think the Seahawks sent a whole team down to Mobile because Tyreke Smith, I thought, actually also had a really, really good Senior Bowl. Yeah, I had Tyreke Smith as like this 4th round caliber player. So for the Seahawks to get him that late, I was very surprised by that. And I was very happy that he fell to the Seahawks, where I think it'll be a good situation for him. 5th round pick, I thought was a steal for Tyreke Smith. Again, he's another guy who I like a lot as a pass rusher. His run defending isn't great. So the Seahawks obviously have a type here where these, good athletes, Tyreke Smith is like 72nd percentile athletes, nothing special, but still excellent Senior Bowl, showed a lot of promise at Ohio State as a pass rusher. And it's just not a great run defender right now. So he and Boye Mafe, I think, are going to be good pass rushers. Have questions about them as run defenders, but they showed a lot of promise in the Senior Bowl, and both of them are at least pretty good athletes. So the Seahawks obviously have a type with these edge defenders.
Was there anybody, just briefly, like looking at like last year's draft, for example, was there anybody who you saw as like you couldn't believe that they had fallen that far, and looking at the rookie season, you feel justified, like feeling like that was such a steal of a pick? Is there anybody that comes to mind in terms of like guys that you really thought fell farther than they should have last year, and now they look like a steal?
Yeah, I hate to brag too much, but the guys who I was like really high on compared to the consensus, and a lot of people said I was crazy for, a lot of them hit. And let me look at my board right now. I had Christian Barmore, number 11 overall on my board. And he fell to the 2nd round, and I was like, that's a steal. Goes to the Patriots. And he showed a lot of promise his rookie year. I think he's going to have a big 2nd-year breakout next year. I had Patrick Surtain as my number 5 overall prospect, or 6 overall prospect, and he fell number 9. And a lot of people had him as like CB2. I saw Surtain as the best corner since Jalen Ramsey, where I was like, this guy, his big question was athleticism, and he comes out as pro day and was an unbelievable athlete as pro day. And I know the pro day's numbers are inflated a little bit, but still, like, he was extremely good at his pro day, and his position, he's so good, is technically so refined at the quarterback position. I loved him, and now he looks like a lockdown corner. Sam Cosmi, I had number 12 overall. That was a guy another fell to the 2nd round. And he looked really good before getting hurt for the Commanders this past season. He looks like their right tackle of the future. So other guys I liked a lot. I liked Azeez Ojulari at the top 20. Now, I know he fell for injury reasons, but still, I liked him enough where I would have taken him, and the Giants got him in the 2nd round, and he looked really good for the Giants this past season. And the one who I really am proud of, I had Javon Holland, number 19 overall. And he's a guy that a lot of people forgot about because he sat out all of last season. He was kind of like the only guy who sat out for the entire season who got screwed for sitting out. Whereas other guys like Penei Sewell, Micah Parsons, Jamar Chase, like they sat out and they're like, or Caleb Farley too. Or like they sat out like, all right, whatever. You know, we know who they are. Javon Holland sat out and he was awesome. And I loved his tape at Oregon. He was a great athlete too. And he went to Miami, and I think he's arguably like a top 5 to 10 safety already in the NFL. So those are some guys that I was very high on in last year's draft that have hit. I definitely had some misses too. I was lower on Creed Humphrey than I should have been. I look back now and I'm like, what the hell was I thinking? And Creed Humphrey was by far PFF's highest graded center, and you can make the argument he's already the best center in the NFL. Like, he was awesome. And I don't know what I was watching and why I had him so low. I had him like a 3rd round pick, and the Chiefs took him the 2nd round. So not too bad, but like, he was so good his rookie year that he makes you look back and go, what the heck did I miss there?
Yeah. That it's one of the things, my interesting story with Javon Holland is I'd never make any bets, but I decided I was so confident that the 49ers were going to draft Mac Jones that I went to Vegas and I placed a bet that several bets that he would go to the 49ers. And then I hedged my bet with like several other draft related bets because I felt very confident in my draft valuations, and I shouldn't have. And, lost everything that I lost on Mac Jones. I got a lot of it back because I took a long shot bet that Javon Holland would be the first safety drafted. And at that point, everyone was saying Trevon Moehrig or Richie Grant would be the first safety drafted. And then all of day one passed without any safeties going. And that was my last hope was Javon Holland. So I've never been so excited for a Dolphins 2nd round safety draft pick in my life as when the name Javon Holland came off instead of Trevon Moehrig. But both were probably steals.
Yeah.
You'd mentioned Patrick Surtain. We'll talk here about the 2 cornerbacks that the Seahawks drafted, Tariq Woolen and Coby Bryant. Coby Bryant, you mentioned, is a guy that you liked. Tariq Woolen has these crazy athletic traits and feels like a potential steal if again like a Malik Willis or like someone else if he can translate those that athleticism and that skill to NFL concepts against NFL players. What were your thoughts on Tariq Woolen out of UTSA?
Woolen I liked. That was a pick that I had him a little bit lower on my board than where they took him at number 153 overall. But like, I understood it. Like, there was one pick where it's like, yeah, he was taken a lot higher than where I had him, and they took him in the 5th round. So at that range, it's like, who cares? Like, they're taking a swing on Tariq Woolen. Tariq Woolen is one of the most athletic corners, not only in this draft, but in like past drafts. Like, he was really like an incredible athlete coming out of UTSA. He tested out like a 97th percentile athlete. He's a huge corner at 6'4", 205 pounds. Like, he looks like a safety. I think he's still really raw. And it's another thing where it's like, proper coaching, we'll see what happens with him. It's kind of like Malik Willis, who's like, yeah, he's going to UTSA right now, not playing as the best talent. But like, when you have a guy like from UTSA and you want to consider him like a good prospect, it's like, you got to dominate the competition that you're playing against then. And I just don't think he did that at UTSA enough. So that's why I had him lower on my board. But the upside is certainly there. He looked decent at the Senior Bowl too. Now that we're talking about all these guys, I really do think the Seahawks put a lot of emphasis on the Senior Bowl. So when you go back to your question of how much emphasis should we put on the Senior Bowl, the Seahawks probably, I guess, all we care about was the Senior Bowl. So Tariq Woolen looked pretty good at the Senior Bowl. I like him in zone coverage. I just think he's got a lot of work to do, and his tape at UTSA wasn't that impressive. And it's tough to convince me to be taking you a lot higher than where they took him, just because not playing at a great school, not playing at a great conference, and when your tape's not like blowing me away, it's tough. But he does have a crazy high ceiling. He is absolutely freaking massive. So we'll see. The Seahawks have a good track record of developing good corners and good secondary players. So Tariq Woolen, I'm excited to see. That was one situation where I was like, all right, if anyone's going to reach on Tariq Woolen, I'm glad it was the Seahawks, because I really trust what they do.
And how much different would that be of your, say, evaluation, floor, ceiling, probability of success as compared to Coby Bryant?
Yeah, Coby Coby Bryant, who won the award, the Jim Thorpe Award for the best defensive back in college football, which they gave out worse. The only comment I can give to that is they gave out worse awards that year, namely Jordan Davis winning every award in the book that year was kind of incredible. But Coby Bryant, I don't know if he deserved that award over his teammate, even in Sauce Gardner. I'm sure Sauce wasn't really that happy in the locker room following that. But Coby Bryant is a guy who has a higher floor, than Tariq Woolen. He's a guy who produced at Cincinnati. He looked good against, again, not great competition, but still good enough. They took him right around where I take him. 109th overall. I had him 104 on my board. He's just not a great athlete. He's a 56th percentile athlete. He's got decent size, but just not very fast or agile. Again, Senior Bowl, looked good at the Senior Bowl. So it's another guy who's just really good at the Senior Bowl. And yeah, I think he's got a higher floor than Tariq Woolen, which is why they took him higher. I just think the ceiling is just not really there. So I can see him as like a depth piece at corner. I struggle to see him ever being like a top 2 corner for a team.
Yeah, and in today's NFL, where do you sort of adjust your positional rankings, as you mentioned, like taking into account, like say, positional value? We can't always, just look at it and say all cornerbacks are created equal, because obviously you need outside cornerbacks and you need nickel cornerbacks. You need outside receivers and you need slot receivers, and maybe there's a slot receiver who in today's NFL has top 15 value in the draft. If he's that good and if he's going to dominate in the middle of the field to that degree. And then sometimes you might need that shutdown guy who may not have the longest arms, may not be the fastest guy on the field, but like a Chris Harris Jr. is going to shut down a player opposite of him who's, as long as he's not built like DK Metcalf or whatever. And sometimes he can even shut down DK Metcalf. Like, where exactly do you place, say, the value on, say, like a inside cornerback or the slot position these days?
It's definitely grown exponentially. And like you mentioned, like slot receivers are more valuable than ever before. Like look at last year, like Cooper Kupp was like the best receiver in the NFL and he played exclusively basically in the slot. If you ask me right now, where would I take Cooper Kupp in a redraft? It'd be pretty freaking high. So slot receivers and slot corners, it matters now. And, it's interesting when you say like, oh, base defense. People can say base defense all the time, like a 4-3 or 3-4. Like, no, that's not base defense anymore. Like you're running, 4 defensive linemen, sure, but it's two linebackers usually and 5 DBs, because you can't afford to have, only 4 less defensive backs on the field, just because, like we mentioned all the time, that it's just a passing game now. You need defensive backs. You need wide receivers. You can't just have one receiver. You can't just have one corner and be like, all right, we're good from there. No, you need multiple weapons, multiple corners. And I think like it's interesting because so many people are like the preconceived notion from when I was growing up, and even now, so many people now think that like the 2 most important positions after quarterback are tackle and edge rusher. I push back on that. I think they are important, don't get me wrong, but I would say corner and wide receiver, just because of the way the game is evolving, the way the game is changing nowadays. You need them. And, people all the time were saying the Bengals, like, why didn't they take Penei Sewell? Like, they should have taken Penei Sewell. Like with Joe Burrow, he got hurt last year. It's like, no, in terms of, you got to find superstars. I'm not saying offensive line is not important, edge defender is not important, but offensive line especially, you don't need superstars. You just got to have like no weak links.
Yeah.
At receiver and in the secondary, like you need superstars. You need the lockdown guys. You need these stud receivers, which is why they took Jamar Chase and why I think the offensive line was obviously good enough to get them to the Super Bowl and almost win the Super Bowl. So it's an interesting discussion nowadays. I think receiver and corner are still being undervalued. Even safety is being undervalued in today's game. But yeah, I think the receiver and secondaries after quarterback, they're the most important thing that you got to build up.
Yeah, it's a different game than it was in the past. Certainly, that is even something that Pete Carroll has recognized by hiring Shane Waldron last year as the offensive coordinator. I think by making a switch this year on defense, not only among coordinators, but recognizing that they have to defend against Cooper Kupp and against right now DeAndre Hopkins and Rondale Moore and all the guys that the Cardinals are bringing and all the guys that the 49ers are bringing, assuming Deebo Samuel's returning and you have to defend George Kittle, and it's like tight ends, receivers, and they're not just, it's not just Megatron where you're like, oh, you have to go out there. No one can stop Megatron. It's like, it's not even just having one Megatron. It's the fact that a team will have 4 Heinz Wardses or whatever,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's so many different places on the field to defend. So that'll be interesting to watch. And the Seahawks certainly might, if you had to measure up, because it's not just the fact that Drew Lock or Geno Smith will probably be a bottom 3 quarterback next year. The Seahawks' number 1 cornerback is Sidney Jones, who came out of college with a very good, he might have been a top 15 pick if not for injury. And now the Seahawks might be a bottom 3 cornerback team right now. And they didn't go cornerback in this draft, but they also didn't really, not in the top 10. They didn't really have that opportunity where maybe in the beginning, before the draft went down, we thought Sauce Gardner or Derek Stingley could be available at 9.
Yeah.
And they went 3-4. So, and that's something that it's almost like the game has changed so fast that it doesn't seem surprising, but it is really surprising that 2 cornerbacks went in the top 4. They're 2 of the only to ever do that ever.
Yeah.
And so part of that, I think, had to do with the draft class where it was, how things shook out, not having a quarterback in there, obviously had an impact there. But yeah, it'll be interesting if Pete Carroll can continue to work some sort of magic on day 3 with cornerbacks, and Coby Bryant and Tariq Woolen are 2 of them. Before we get out of here, I want to talk to you about the 2 receivers that the Seahawks drafted, and then we can end this talking about Kenneth Walker and discussing the value there at 41 with Kenneth Walker. But with regards to these 2 receivers, it's very, very difficult to get value out of any player in the 7th round that isn't a special teams value. They just don't exist. There's not very many players in history who've come out of the 7th round, including wide receivers, and been Pro Bowlers or even consistent starters. The Seahawks took a pair of receivers in the 7th round. You mentioned Bo Melton out of Rutgers, and that was a guy who I believe had really good athletic testing. And then you've got Dareke Young. Did you have Dareke Young on your radar going into the draft?
No, unfortunately, I had 350 prospects, and he unfortunately slipped under my radar. There was a few guys who slipped that didn't make it, but Nick actually went back and watched Tariq Young, and he's like, I actually liked his tape a little bit. So I trust Nick a lot, and he liked him a lot, so I'm interested in that. Bo Melton was a guy I liked a lot, and sounded like a broken record, but he went to the Senior Bowl and looked pretty good at the Senior Bowl again. This has really been a revelation, this podcast for me, about how much emphasis the Seahawks have put on the Senior Bowl.
We got this from the Senior Bowl Twitter account. 6 players at the Senior Bowl this year were drafted by the Seahawks.
Oh my God. Yeah, there we go. So obviously Pete Carroll and Jim Nagy have a pretty good relationship. Bo Melton was a guy I was a little bit lower on. I like the range where he went though. Really good athlete. Once again, 93rd percentile athlete. I thought his tape at Rutgers was decent. He's a slot receiver probably, which we just mentioned is becoming more and more valuable in the NFL. I think he's a guy who could really, really contribute on the Seahawks. Eventually maybe becoming the number 3 receiver if they keep DK Metcalf and they keep Tyler Lockett, which I don't know if they will. But I think that he could eventually become a starting slot receiver for that team.
Their opportunities are there. The Seahawks have Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, and last year they drafted D. Eskridge. But the opportunities are there because there's not really a ton else going on, and so anybody could jump in. A few years ago the Seahawks drafted David Moore in the 7th round, and he was a receiver that had some value for Seattle. Before I get to Kenneth Walker, if we could address quickly a question here from the chat. Dwayne Nowak asking what happened to Tanner Muse, a star in college, injured in his first season, drafted by the Raiders, safety, converted linebacker. The Seahawks do have needs at linebacker. Max, do you have any thoughts on Tanner Muse? Do you remember if you had evaluated Tanner Muse coming out of Clemson, and any thoughts on his fit for the NFL?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I've been making some TikToks lately, and Nick Muse, Tanner's little brother, was commenting and asking about his brother. Tanner has unfortunately got the short end of the stick. He hasn't really played that much. I liked his tape a lot coming out of Clemson. He was a third-round pick. He was an extremely athletic player coming out of Clemson. Like I think literally tested as like a 98th percentile athlete or something like that, which is crazy. He's got decent size for a linebacker. Again, I liked what he showed at Clemson. He didn't get to show that much in Seattle. And honestly, yeah, looking at PFF right now, he only played one snap last season for Seattle. So obviously didn't get to do too much. But unfortunately, injuries have kind of derailed his career a little bit, but he's still so young. This is a guy who's only going to be 26 years old in September. So I still think there's a world where he could contribute for the Seahawks. He obviously couldn't do it for the Raiders, but I think eventually he could become a guy for the Seattle.
So the competition is there. The Seahawks passed on, and again, at 41, we're going to talk about Kenneth Walker now to close out. But at 41, there were linebackers there where people could have said, oh, take Nakobe Dean, take Channing Tindall, take Troy Anderson, take any of these linebackers. And the Seahawks instead will be holding some competitions there with a lot of guys in our Muse range. We'll see what happens. Instead, the Seahawks did something very Pete Carroll-like, which is draft a running back. Kenneth Walker III. There were just two running backs in this draft class that fit into that consensus of like these would be the two guys who could be fringe first rounders. I think another era not that long ago, Kenneth Walker and Breece Hall would have both been first round picks, if not top 20 picks. That's just different eras, getting value where you can. And obviously right now the discussion isn't necessarily that Breece Hall and Kenneth Walker are bad players or bad running backs, so that they won't be good running backs at the next level. The discussion more has to do with whether or not, just like you wouldn't draft a punter in round 4, would you draft a running back at 41? And the Seahawks would, and they did. So that's what we'll see happen here. And I think at the very least, we can say that Kenneth Walker went to a situation that's great for him because the Seahawks are really going to value that position. They've got a couple other running backs there to take some of the pressure off to begin. And I think that is also important. Kenneth Walker, Wake Forest recruit, wasn't one of the top 2,000 recruits in the country, just not recruited at all. But immediately at Wake Forest, it was clear this guy should have not gone to Wake Forest. Dominated in the slow mesh offense, and then looked for a way to raise his stock, which he did tremendously by going to Michigan State last year, rushing for over 1,600 yards, over 200 yards in the first game against Northwestern. Just a very dominant college running back last year. So first of all, with Kenneth Walker's college season last year, how much different do you think Kenneth Walker is like as a college running back? How much more special and different was he than the majority of college running backs?
Oh, he was very special last year. And, the fact that I didn't like the pick doesn't mean that I didn't like Kenneth Walker a lot. Like, I had him as a second-round prospect on my board. He was special. Like, he really was, like, probably the best running back in college football last year. Yeah, he did win the Doak Walker Award, too. He was extremely good. And, he was a guy for a lot of people came out of nowhere. And, like, where did this guy come from? I loved his tape at Wake Forest, too. Like, when Michigan State got him in the transfer portal, I was like, this is going to be a really, really awesome fit for Michigan State. And he was. He is extremely elusive. Like, he had a broken tackle rate that was, like, rivaling Javonte Williams, like the best that we've seen in college football the last 7 or so years. Really good in the gap scheme, really good in the zone scheme. He's just not much of a receiver right now, which is, whatever. I think it's an important part of a running back in today's day and age, but I think he's capable. It's just that he hasn't really done it yet. He's a really good athlete, 93rd percentile. But otherwise, he was a phenomenal running back prospect. I had him as like RB2 in the draft, right behind Breece Hall. I really struggled ranking those two. But Kenneth Walker is just the most elusive running back in the draft by far.
Yeah, and I mean, like, when it all came down to it, sure enough, Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, they went in their range early second round. Then you had James Cook later in the second round. There was a huge gap for how the NFL evaluated those two running backs against the rest. And obviously James Cook, like the anti Kenneth Walker, in that there's not sure if he can run. They're just very happy with how he can receive. I do think that like the Seahawks may employ a lot of receiving for Kenneth Walker. I've heard of recently that the Vikings new head coach, Kevin O'Connell, who also is a former Rams offensive coordinator under Sean McVay, is working out Dalvin Cook in a lot of receiver sets and trying to get Dalvin Cook may even spread out as a receiver more often next year. I could see Kenneth Walker filling such a role. Didn't seem like, sort of like Charles Cross, he just needs the reps in an area of the game that he didn't get in his system. But Walker, whether he went to Wake Forest or Michigan State, he didn't choose an offense that was going to ask him to catch the ball. So it's interesting to see how that could work out at the next level. Did you see? We got a list here maybe of some of the rookie running backs like Dameon Pierce, Rashad White. Did you see any of these running backs potentially being the big steal after the second round that could make the Seahawks wish that they could have waited to draft a running back on day 3 or round 3?
It was interesting. So Dameon Pierce was my RB3, and he ended up going in the 4th round, which I thought was really good value for him. But it was kind of a 2-horse race. Whereas, like, if Seattle was desperate for a running back, which I don't understand why they would be, but if you're really desperate, like, you get one of those two guys. You get either Breece Hall or you get Kenneth Walker III. Like, after those two, there was a huge gap between RB2 and RB3, in my opinion. I just didn't love the fit for Seattle because you re-signed Chris Carson. Re-signed Rashad Penny. Yeah. Chris Carson, who I know is injured, and I know a lot of people are concerned about him. But Rashad Penny looked finally really good, and Seattle was finally he's making good on the promise that he was as a first-round pick, which I thought was, again, too high when he was taken. It was just an interesting fit for me because it was like when you take a guy like Charles Cross and you take a guy like Abraham Lucas. That to me was like, oh, they're gearing up to maybe take a quarterback here. It's like maybe Pete Carroll is finally learning passing is more important than running the football. And then they take Kenneth Walker III. And it's like, wait, you just took literally the 2 best pass protectors in the draft that both have questions about them as run blockers. And then you take a running back. So I understand, pushing back the quarterback thing for a little bit until next year probably, where they can try to get a Bryce Young or CJ Stroud. It just the fit with Seattle, I was just like, every pick that I love for Seattle, I really liked Seattle's draft a lot. It's just that pick was kind of a head scratcher for me.
Really quickly, just if I could quickly name out, because as prepared as I thought that I was for the draft, by the time I get to the undrafted free agents, I'm like, how do I not even know these guys' names? I mean, at least how has this never come across? They had to be in the draft pool, and I was looking at 7th round picks, but obviously I didn't do enough research. The Seahawks signed 14 undrafted free agents: Joey Blunt, Bubba Bolden, Cade Brewer, Shamarius Gilmore, Matt Gotel, Jake Herslau, Levi Jones, Levi Lewis, John Mitchell, Scott Nelson, Josh Ogu, Demetrius Robertson, Josh Valentine Turner, Deontay Williams. Do any of those names stand out to you? Any one of those names stand out to you?
The one that stands out to me, I would say, is Bubba Bolden from Miami. I didn't have him as a draftable prospect. I really didn't watch too many of those other guys, to be honest. But Bubba Bolden was a guy that, like, before the season was thought of as like this maybe first round type prospect. And it was crazy that, he ended up going undrafted. I never was a huge fan of his tape. I didn't think he was that good at Miami as a safety. He's a 5th-year senior, decent athlete, 81st percentile. But otherwise, like, I wasn't a huge fan of him. So, it was interesting seeing him, a guy who's a consensus first-round pick in the summer of last year, and all of a sudden now he's an undrafted free agent. That was pretty interesting.
Last thing, for real, finally, last thing. I have to ask, you and definitely anybody else that comes onto the show, just because it's sort of my thing, and people who follow Seaside Joe know that this has been my thing for the last year. You talked about how you have different valuations sometimes with prospects than other people. You're higher on them, and you feel like these are my guys no matter what anyone says. My guy is Grayson McCall. I think this is my superstar in the draft. He's underrated. I mean, nobody agrees with me. There are a few people out there that are like, yeah, he could be a first-round pick, but it's very rare so far still. He does play at Coastal Carolina. He doesn't have the strongest arm velocity-wise. He's very systemic. He's like in a very clear system there. But I thought he could have transferred to another school, just like Kenneth Walker this year, and really dominated at a bigger program, or at least proven one way or the other where he's going to fall. Where are you?
Yeah, Grayson McCall was a guy that I'm also with you. I think Grayson McCall has a lot to offer. And, he played in this like triple option-ish offense at Coastal Carolina, which is not the best when evaluating next to the NFL, but I was with you. I think Grayson McCall's a big sleeper in this draft, and I think Grayson McCall could be, one of the top 10-ish quarterbacks for sure in next year's draft. I do think it's a pretty good quarterback class, though.
Sorry, I dropped my thing dropped off there.
You're good. It's been a bad day for us. I was just saying, I agree with you. I think Grayson McCall has something to offer, and he's graded out really well for PFF the last couple of years, and he plays in a triple option E offense, which is never great when evaluating towards the NFL, but he was dominant at Coastal Carolina. I agree with you. I wish he would have transferred, but yeah, he's a guy that is definitely on my radar next year, and I could see potentially becoming like a day 2 pick.
Yeah, we'll see. It's a very interesting quarterback class, one that could have some guys step up, whether that's McCall, Will Levis, or someone else. Yeah. Lots of names behind the top 2. Max Chadwick, thank you so much for your time here, joining Seaside Joe and talking Seahawks draft picks. I want everyone to subscribe to the channel Boom or Bust, the draft show. I know that it is going to have so much more great content this year because you guys have consistently put out a good show every single time. So anything else that you'd like to plug or where people can find you?
Yeah, the Boom or Bust, the draft show. We have a TikTok, we have a Twitter, we have an Instagram. We've posted a lot on TikTok lately, so make sure you guys check that out. You can follow me at Chad_Maxwick on Twitter. And for all the Seahawks fans out there going to be a lot of people next year. I just want to put this out now that are going to doubt Bryce Young because he's too small. And you guys should know more than anyone that quarterback height does not matter with Russell Wilson. So if you're in the running for the number 1 pick, which unfortunately you probably might be, Bryce Young is the real deal. He is the real freaking deal, and I'm excited for him next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the Seahawks could be the number 1 pick in the draft, so we'll see what happens. And Bryce Young, I didn't watch as much of guys who weren't eligible for this past draft, but every time I put on Bryce Young, it's like, goodness gracious, if this guy was in the draft, the whole thing would shut down because he's so clearly number 1.
He's like I say he's like a bite-sized version of Trevor Lawrence, honestly. Where it's like his processing is like next level. His arm talent is incredible. He's so accurate. Like this guy is never making the wrong plays. Honestly, he is absolutely incredible.
I can't wait for this college season. I can't wait to see what happens next and everything else. So thanks again, Max. Thanks, Max Chadwick, for joining Seaside Joe. And if you're out there listening, watching, subscribe to the channel. Subscribe to seasidejoe.substack.com for a free daily Seahawks newsletter. And there will be more episodes coming out here shortly. So watch this and definitely watch Boom or Bust, the draft show on YouTube. Follow them on Twitter and TikTok. That's it for this episode. See you next time for another one.